In the name of the living God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. So we're thinking today about healing. Healing, and how important that is as we journey together as a community. And so that image of Jesus lifting up the mother-in-law of Simon is a very powerful image for us right at this time. And why is healing important to the church, one might ask? A couple of years ago, I did a lot of work with UNESCO, and I had the opportunity to help them look at the ancient sites of Christianity in Israel. And to become a World Heritage Site, first of all, the sites have to have some kind of outstanding universal value. And so the Israeli government, the state, actually has to propose the recommendation of why particular sites should be of world importance. And so the Israeli government, in conjunction with a number of NGOs and the faith community, put together about a dozen sacred sites in Galilee and in Nazareth, and began to kind of look at what's the universal value in these sites. And one of the ideas was that Jesus was a healer, and that Jesus inspired not only music and art and culture, but that Jesus inspired the healing movement in the world, that hospitals and medicine and that kind of sacrificial giving of oneself is something that comes from this one life. And it's interesting that, you may dispute whether Jesus was divine or Jesus was the Messiah, but there is agreement. There is agreement, even in the secular world, that Jesus was a healer, and that this was something that attracted people to him. This story that we're reading about today is a part of that. So the Good Samaritan is another example. Jesus tells, "Who is my neighbor?" My neighbor is the person who is in the middle of my road on my journey. It is inconvenient, says Jesus, to be a healing presence in the world when your neighbor has been beaten up or your neighbor is in need of attention. And so this image of the Samaritan, who is a foreign outsider, becomes for Jesus the prototype of the human being, what it means to be a proper neighbor in relationship with other human beings. And not only does the Good Samaritan go out of his way to make sure that this man is taken care of, but he pays for his care, and he makes sure that whatever he needs is being dealt with. So this raising up, that image of Jesus raising up Simon Peter's mother-in-law, is an image for the whole of humanity, that Jesus the healer invites us to contemplate today. This lifting up is a type of code that the gospel writer is using to prophesy the transforming power of the Spirit of God that is leashed upon the world. It would not only raise up Peter's mother-in-law to new life, but it would raise her son to new and abundant life in Jesus, and would raise Jesus from death itself. So this is about the work of the Spirit. That reading from Isaiah, there's a very powerful reading. We're grasshoppers. We think we're here. We think we're wonderful. We think we're permanent. But that reading is about getting in touch with, it's the Spirit of God that gives us life. It is the Spirit of God that broods over the face of creation. It is that Spirit of God that for a while we participate in as human beings. And that Spirit of God is also transformative. The wind blows over it, and it is gone. So that Isaiah reading is also about putting us in our place. It's almost like a kind of preview of Ash Wednesday, that you're dust. You're dust, and to dust will you become. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. So Capernaum is crazy with the stories circulating about Jesus. And you'd think that healing and repairing the world would be something that everybody could get, everybody would vote for, everybody would say, this is a good idea, Jesus, you're doing good. But it's interesting that it's the healing miracles of Jesus that actually gets him into trouble. The gospel opens with Jesus and the disciples return from the synagogue. What has just happened in the synagogue? He has cast out a demon. He has healed somebody, we would say maybe of mental instability. And because he heals him on the Sabbath and he heals him in the synagogue, it's controversial. It's controversial. And so he has publicly, with authority, cast out a demon. And even the religious establishment are astounded. What authority! Even the unclean spirits obey him. And so by nightfall, Peter's neighborhood is full of people wanting to see Jesus, to touch him, to be healed by him. And so Capernaum becomes the center of a very important phase in this ministry of Jesus. It is a place that creates a reputation for him. Some of it is positive, but most of it is negative. Jesus performs miracles that night, healings and exorcisms, and we find him troubled, and he gets up before everybody else. In this story, he gets up in the kind of early morning, and he's trying to figure out, he wants to go and pray and figure out what's he going to do. People are misunderstanding him. The people want to see the circus. People want to it's all kind of bizarre and weird. But that Spirit of God touching all life, all of us, connected to one another in the ministry of healing, people aren't getting that. Even my disciples, he thinks, want to become wonder workers instead of getting to know me and my mission. So what can I do? So Capernaum becomes a place of stigma for Jesus. The religious authorities, initially impressed by his authority, will also have a problem with him healing on the Sabbath. Not just one person, but a whole community breaking the law. One of the people Jesus will heal in Capernaum is going to really upset people. He heals the son of a royal official, maybe a Roman or a Galilean Jew employed by the local puppet King Herod. And to work a miracle for the instrument of oppression, a Roman collaborator. But Jesus has no problem healing a foreigner. Those funny names in the Old Testament, we have the Shunamites and so on. But it's interesting that these healing miracles also parallel Old Testament healing miracles of foreigners. And so Jesus just responds to a human being in need. Doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter your nationality. It doesn't matter your politics. It's a human being in need, someone in the road, someone who's in the way of where I want to get to. And Jesus connects with that person and heals them. And he's prepared to get in trouble for doing that. He's about to go to all this happens before he goes to his own home synagogue. And he's going to preach his first sermon there. And the lectionary is from the book of the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news of the afflicted. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives, sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim a year of favor from the Lord. It's kind of his manifesto. It's the church's manifesto. And it's all about healing. It's all about healing. And at first, the sermon, he impresses his family and his friends. They all think he's great. But then he starts referring to some Old Testament healings that were about people who are not our kind. He touches on the kind of nationalism stuff. He touches on the religious purity stuff. And the fact that a foreigner is healed by Elisha, a widow from another country, is healed by the Spirit of God. And people are, no, that's not right. God, we're God's people. We're the people that God favors. And so it's interesting that he touches a nerve in them. And it's about kind of their privilege. It's about their religious and political, cultural privilege that gets them really annoyed, so annoyed that they want to destroy him. And they take him out of that synagogue and they want to throw him over a bluff. But he passes through them, as we are told, and he walks away. So as we follow the early months of Jesus' ministry, we get a sense that something so powerful and wonderful as healing people and casting out demonic spirits would be a positive thing, that people would love it and love him. But it becomes an issue not only for the religious authorities, but for people close to Jesus, his hometown, and even his own family. By Mark chapter 3, verse 30, we are told Jesus is accused himself of having an unclean spirit, and his family have come to take him home. They think he's crazy. So the healing and casting out of demons begins to overshadow Jesus' ability to proclaim the message of the coming of the reign of God. And so Jesus' ministry shifts at a certain point to try and keep people on focus. Sometimes it is with the disciples who get carried away with their own accomplishments and their own healing and demonic liberation. Sometimes it's with the crowds. And Jesus' ministry over 3 years is like a kind of inverted hourglass. It begins with a few people, then you have the crowds, then you have the circus, you have all the healing stuff. And then Jesus begins to turn in and avoids the crowds and then starts working on those smaller groups, the 70 and the 12, right to the end, just before the cross, when it was a handful of people. Peter, James, and John. The circus has to go. The kingdom of God has somehow to be proclaimed. And so following the resurrection of Jesus, interesting again, a lot of the resurrection is dealing with the scars. Keep showing us scars. You know, what is it about our scars? Our scars show that we're broken, that we are ill, we are diseased, we have suffered. And the scars represent our healing. But the healing doesn't take the scars away. And there's a relationship between how vulnerable we are and how open we are to talking about that human suffering, and how that suffering has been transformed, or maybe it's not totally taken away, but we're living with it, but that somehow we are healed. I remember in the 1980s when we were working, many of us in the churches, we were working in AIDS. And we didn't have a cure. We didn't have the magic bullet the way we have now. We have lots of medicines now, but back then we didn't. But people were afraid to touch, just like today we're terribly afraid to be close to people. But in the AIDS crisis, we were afraid that you touched somebody with AIDS, you'd get AIDS. And in fact, we found out it was actually very difficult. It's much more difficult to get AIDS than it is to get COVID. But there was an awful stigma about it, and so people were shunned. People, even in church hospitals. I remember in Los Angeles, we had an Episcopal hospital where people would be left in their rooms and food would be left outside. They'd be stigmatized. So we were afraid. And so just touching somebody was healing. And that ministry where we anoint people with oil, we anoint people with oil and remind them of their baptism, that they're loved by God. Just doing that was a healing moment for people. And so one's ministry, one's sense of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus, the healer, was transformed. And it was also countercultural. People didn't like it, touching people with AIDS or welcoming people with AIDS in our churches. It was controversial. I remember we did a whole lot of things with AIDS masses, where we would gather people together to remember often people who not only were sick, but people who had died. And I was thinking about how that might apply to our world today with we've lost so many people. But how do we grieve and mourn, and how do we heal from all of that as the followers of Jesus, the healer? And what I learned also over the years, again, I don't have a medical background, but I ended up working in a lot of significant healthcare planning because that ministry of Jesus inspired me, and also inspired me to take controversial positions that ultimately were right. One particular story, and again, you'd think it would be obvious, but we set up the first HIV testing site in Los Angeles in about 1985. And at that time, if you were diagnosed with HIV, you had about 9 months to live. You would get this terrible infection in your lungs, and within 9 months to a year, you were gone. So if you found out that you were HIV positive, chances are you needed to get your affairs in order because you weren't going to live. And so part of the deal with the state of California was that as we set up this HIV testing, when people would find out if they were positive or not, the state said, all we will pay for, we'll only pay $12 for that test with no pre or post-test counseling. And I was working at the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center at the time. I was acting executive director. I was in my early 30s. Again, I didn't know very much, but this idea of Jesus the healer, to me, it was immoral. It was immoral to ask people to come in for a test without having some kind of pre- and post-test mental health support. And we just sat on that contract. We would not open that center. And it was very controversial. We got hit from all sides. But ultimately, the state gave us what we wanted. And mental health and physical health, for the first time in the state's history, was connected. And we got that contract. And so thousands of people were able to get that kind of support. But again, healing, not everybody's on the same page. You think about healthcare in this country, how controversial it is, right? So what does that mean for us as the church engaged in the healing ministry of Jesus? We think of what is it we can do in our country to bring people together. We think about what happened last year about so many people, we're just operating from different playbooks. What is it we can have in common, we can bring together, we can talk about? Black Lives Matter. What is it as a wealthy, privileged white congregation sitting above Philadelphia, one of the most, in terms of healthcare and poverty, we are one of the most impoverished cities in the country. And many of our congregation have been working for years to heal that. But what does it mean today? What does it mean for us today in the conversations that we're having, in the planning that we are doing for St. Paul's in the future that will heal this world? And it's still controversial. There are lots of people in this congregation. We don't want to know. We don't want to deal with racism. We don't want to even talk about it. We don't want to talk about white privilege. So healing is controversial. And so we have to somehow discern in our minds the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God that even though we're grasshoppers, and even though we think we're going to be here forever, there is a kind of moment where the decisions that we are going to make will either heal or continue to fracture and to hurt God's creation. So I pray that as we think about the ministry of healing in the church, the ministry of healing in St. Paul's, the ministry of healing that's going on in your homes right now, how you are protecting your children and your parents and your grandparents and your neighbors and taking responsibility for each other and encouraging each other to continue as best we can through this really difficult time. The ministry of the church has never been more important than it is right now. So thank you, Jesus, for this gift of confidence in your spirit as you go forth and you speak and you touch and you heal. And I close with this. Often when I anoint someone, I make the sign of the cross with holy oil as a sign of God's healing presence. And the blessing is, I anoint you in the name of the God who loves you, who is creating you, and who is bearing your pain. I anoint you in the name of the God who is loving you, who is creating you, and is bearing your pain. That is our gift to one another right now. It's timeless. It is something that the Spirit of God will continue to work in us and through us. Thanks be to God.